This episode of Working is brought to you by Progressive. Most of you aren't just listening right now. You're driving or cleaning or exercising or maybe even playing the bassoon. But what if you could be saving money by switching to Progressive? Well, drivers who save by switching save nearly $700 on average, and auto customers qualify for an average of 7 discounts. Multitask right now. Quote today at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $698 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2021 and May 2022. Potential savings will vary. Discounts not available in all states and situations.
The focus of this was sort of to get stories to come out of the game, right? People aren't going to tell a story, an interesting story about, I got hit and I lost 7 hit points. But if it was, I got hit and I lost my right hand and dropped my weapon, then suddenly that's a moment, right? And everyone understands that.
Welcome back to Working. I'm your host, Karen Hahn.
And I am your other host, Isaac Butler.
Hello, Isaac. So who did you talk to for this week's episode?
This week, I talked to Tarn and Zach Adams. They're brothers, and together they created the video game Dwarf Fortress, which is, well, one of the most important games of this century.
Whoa. Well, can you explain to us, well, number one, how you came across Dwarf Fortress, and then number two, why it's one of the most important games of the century?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually don't remember how I first came across it, probably just because I like colony sim games, which is at its heart what Dwarf Fortress is. It actually kind of birthed that genre, and it remains both the most complicated and the weirdest game in that genre. And so I've wanted to interview the Adams brothers for a long time because Dwarf Fortress is it's a totally bizarre, quixotic, eccentric experiment of a game that not only created the genre of the colony sim, but it's incredibly influential. Without Dwarf Fortress, there's no The Sims, there's no Minecraft, there's no Don't Starve, there's probably no Fortnite, actually. It's that influential. And it's also the life's work of these two brothers. They've been working on it for 20 years. They have at least 20 more years of things they want to put in the game. Because the game involves all these in-depth systems that are running in the background and procedural generation and stuff. And they just have systems upon systems upon systems that they still want to build. It's really a kind of original achievement, and no one else has done anything like it in this extremely young art form of video games. And the other thing is that it was in an open beta for 20 years, which means people could play it for free. And they recently started selling it. They decided they would put nice graphics on it and sell it. And they became instant multimillionaires as a result when they had only ever made money off a PayPal tip jar up till that point. So I was also just really interested in why would you do any of this?
So really quickly as an aside, for any of our listeners who might not be familiar with the genre, what is a colony sim?
That's a great question. A colony sim is a game where you are building the living environment of usually procedurally generated characters. So these are characters the game is creating for you, and you have to help them survive and thrive and be happy and usually accomplish some objective or another through what resources you're harvesting, what buildings you're crafting, what upgrades you choose, things like that.
Well, thank you so much for the rundown. I am so excited to check this conversation out. But before we get to it, what can Slate Plus listeners look forward to this week?
Well, I think you as an art history major will really enjoy Slate Plus this week, Karen. Although if you're not an art history major, listeners, you'll still enjoy it. Because believe it or not, Dwarf Fortress is in the permanent collection of the Museum of Modern Art. Mm-hmm. And it was actually purchased for that purpose way before the Adams brothers became well-known or well-connected in the games community. It's actually one of the things that put them on the map for the rest of the games community. And so I just wanted to ask about how that happened and what they thought about it and how it changed their careers and lives.
I am so excited to check that out. And Slate Plus members will hear that at the end of the episode. But if you're not a Slate Plus member but want to hear that segment, why not join Slate Plus? As a member, you'll get no ads on any of our podcasts, unlimited reading on the Slate site, and member-exclusive episodes and segments from our show and other shows like The Waves, Culture Gabfest, and Amicus. Sign up for Slate Plus now at slate.com/workingplus to access all of Slate's content and to support our work. All right, let's hear Isaac's conversation with Tarn and Zach Adams.
Zach and Tarn Adams, thank you so much for joining us today on Working to talk about your process.
All right.
Yeah, good to be here.
And just so our listeners have some hope of telling your voices apart, since this is an audio podcast, which one of you is which?
Okay, so I'm Zach, and
I'm Tarn.
It's funny because normally when we have collaborative teams here on Working, writing teams or whatever, we tend to ask them, oh, where did you meet? How did you start working together? But of course, you two are brothers. So I guess instead the question is, how'd you decide to start doing game development together? Zach, you go first.
so this is we kind of grew up in the age of the computer, like the personal computer rather. And our dad taught us how to program when I was 5 years old, and Tarn was even younger.
Yeah, I don't remember a time without computers where I was learning to code the same time I was learning to read, the same time I was learning to add numbers together.
We were really good at algebra when we finally aged into that.
Amazing. So obviously we are here to mostly talk about Dwarf Fortress, which is a game you've been working on for literal decades, and people have been playing it for almost all of that time, but in a kind of constantly evolving beta. It wasn't for sale, but now it is. You can buy it with graphics and music, and we're going to keep talking about how it's continued to evolve as well. But first, for our listeners who are just kind of unfamiliar with what the game is, how do you explain Dwarf Fortress?
So it is like one of the first colony sims where you craft different goods and stuff to help your colony survive.
Right.
The basic pitch is that you've got a settlement of dwarves that are, working in workshops, facing dangers and so forth. And then there's kind of the broader picture that we sort of aspire to be a fantasy world simulator.
Right.
I dare say the most complicated fantasy world simulator out there.
Yeah.
Well, except for the one that is simulating our world, of course.
Yes.
Well, we probably.
Well, that's not fantasy. That's a gritty urban and rural sim.
Now, your game is in a lot of other games' DNA that, our listeners may not have played Dwarf Fortress, but if you've played Minecraft, the creator of Minecraft has credited Dwarf Fortress as his major inspiration. Fortnite has a lot of Dwarf Fortress in it. If you're ever, crafting something to survive and making a base, it's probably somehow inspired by Dwarf Fortress. But I'm interested in, what is in the DNA of the game for you? Like when you were starting to work on it, what games were you thinking about, or what was influencing you? What was in the cauldron that created Dwarf Fortress?
So it was a lot of, obviously like movies and books and stuff, with fantasy novels and stuff like that, and Dungeons and Dragons, and for video games it would be like Ultima. This is because there's two parts of Dwarf Fortress. I don't know, we didn't even get into that. There's the base building part of Dwarf Fortress, and then there's adventure mode, which is like a regular RPG. Well, not regular; it's pretty strange, but that part hasn't even got into the Steam, the part that we're selling now only has the fortress mode, and the adventure part, which is going to come and shock the world, I'm sure, is the second mode, which is coming out later. Our fans wanted both of them to come out at the same time, but we had to say, do you want to wait another
year or two?
It
was already 3 years.
And so they got fortress mode only, but fortress mode is by far the most popular one.
Yeah, which is odd because we started with the RPGs, the games that we were working on before, starting from like age 11, 12, were all just like role-playing games. We never really had a settlement management game at all.
Yeah, that was
even through our 20s. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that wasn't the idea at all. It was just what it was you would make this colony, and then it would get destroyed because you would dig too deep and release monsters, and you would and the whole idea was to fail, because then you would go into adventure mode and go back into your own dungeon that you had created, and the treasures that your dwarves had left after they got creamed by monsters would be there, and it would be just like a dungeon dive from Dungeons and Dragons. It would be completely set up to be, oh wow, now I get to play this game.
So can you talk me through a little bit in those early couple years maybe of how it wound up ballooning into, what it became, how it became much more about building the fortress than it did about adventuring, and then when the kind of procedural generation and simulation comes in? Because just for our listeners who may not understand, and we'll talk about this more later, I'm sure, when you play the game, it is generating a world for you that only exists for your playthrough through these procedures, and that includes hundreds of years of history.
Right.
It's a whole world. You only are playing through a little bit of that world, and the whole rest of the world is going on at the same time. I imagine it took quite a while to get from that idea you articulated to even thinking about, well, what if we just fuck it, let's simulate a world. So I'm just sort of wondering, what was the process that led to that? How did you figure out that that's what you were going to do?
It was because Dwarf Fortress wasn't the beginning of the creation of this. It was way back when we were making an RPG that had a giant world like that. It was called Slaves to Armagh, God of Blood. And we were
sorry, could you say that one more time?
It was called Slaves to Armagh, God of Blood.
Amazing. Okay, keep going.
Was the very first version of this game, and it was just going to be freeware. We are just going to, the name is ridiculous. We didn't care. We just wanted to
it was in fact freeware. We released it for 4 years.
Right. It was completely free and
3D graphics.
We had 3D graphics.
The philosophy at the time was we've had a few of these in the past. They've fallen apart for various reasons. Well, let's work from the bottom up this time. Just a terrible idea. And so we built it. We had tissues. It would describe your arm hair and stuff. I mean, this was a 3D game, but it's still a lot of text. It was very text heavy, and it had all the different flash points. And I remember we made a demon that had eyeballs that were affected by sunlight. So if it ever went out in the light, its eyes would catch on fire, and the model would kind of have these flames shooting out of its eyes.
Wild.
Just strange prioritization here, but this is leading to why Dwarf Fortress ended up the way it did. Yeah. Dwarf Fortress, on the side, we released these really simple graphics games. Like we had a text game called Liberal Crime Squad. We had a 2D game called World War I Medic. That those were the two that got any kind of traction at all as side projects. And Dwarf Fortress was just going to be a side project. It's a text game. We throw it together, put it out in a couple months. And so we're sitting here working on the first part of it, which is the fortress mode, right? It was going to be fortress mode, then adventure mode. So we have these little workshops, and we have these little people with smiley faces, just text smiley faces, walking around doing jobs, digging into the side of a mountain. And everything was so fast compared to the slog that we had been doing that we're like, oh, this is a fantasy game. Let's just start pulling some of these Armagh ideas in. And it never stopped.
Yeah, the
4 years of this.
Right. We realized, and this is funny because it's being undone now that we're releasing with graphics and stuff that we've been working on for 3 years with the artists. But it's because in the beginning there were no graphics, so we could make it as crazy as we wanted to. We could add so much stuff because we weren't worried about having to make it 3D and whatnot, because we were using the ASCII code.
Right.
Yeah.
So for our listeners who haven't seen old school Dwarf Fortress, and you can of course Google image search if you want, it's all ASCII characters. It's just letters and numbers and little brackets and parentheses and stuff. Like the dwarves are represented by like a little yellow smiley face. I forget what it is.
That's a carpenter. Yeah. The carpenter is a yellow smiley face, but like a fisher dwarf would be a blue one.
Right. And a goblin is a G, and a goat
just
is
the letter
G.
G, right.
Just a letter G.
So by the time you're releasing it to the public in the kind of long beta in 2006, was the idea originally that it would just kind of exist in this form and you would keep tinkering with it forever? Was the idea that you were just going to play test it for a little bit with the public for a couple of years and then you'd be done? Like, at what point did this become, for lack of a less hoity-toity way of talking about it, your life's work?
It was when we realized that everything could be displayed in a 3D ASCII environment.
That's kind of like the sort of, this can be the, I don't know, project or whatever that can absorb all our dreams. And then there's the other question, which is like, how can we possibly survive on this?
Right.
And then, but there was the point at which we did, the reason that we're successful actually financially and all that is because we created a community. Mm-hmm. We had our own website, and just people kept flocking to it because the game was just so weird. Like elephants on fire trampling through your fortress, giant carp eating your dwarves. That kind of stuff just went through the internet and brought us so many different people that just spread the word. And that's the reason we were successful.
And how much of your day-to-day job is managing or interacting with that community as opposed to working on the actual game? Like, do you spend a lot of time, interacting with users and talking to them? Or is it more that you just created a home where they could come to and do all that stuff themselves?
I mean, there's a monthly Q&A we do over there. This takes like an entire day,
right.
A month.
I mean, it's part of your creative process is how you create the audience for your work, right?
Yeah, we interact with suggestions, at least passively, looking at the giant forum there.
Release our financials every month.
Yeah, right. The Bay12 report. That's just been a big part of how things operate. We haven't yet crossed the bridge of how that's going to work. Next month.
We should say, is when you become actually wealthy, because the first payments from Steam start arriving.
Yeah, they just start arriving. Do we put that in the financial report now?
Right. I mean, which you've been very open about in interviews and stuff that, you can go on Steam and look right now. It's you've made millions of dollars, if I remember correctly, since the game finally officially went on sale, which is a life-changing thing to contemplate. But even before that, how were you surviving? Did you took donations? Did you do Kickstarters? Are you doing work for other people as well? Are you
It was just contributions from the fans. Yeah, it was just like
PayPal button. Yeah, we had a tip jar.
I'm trying to think of what's that called when PBS.
The pledge drive.
Pledge drive.
Yeah, we did. We had a pledge drive for adding animals to the game. We added 200 animals to the game, and of course our fans are quite practical and mercenary. So the bee one, so that we could add honey and wax, and
right.
And we spent a month doing that. That was great. That was we made $9,000 or something that month.
We'll be back with more of Isaac's conversation with Tarn and Zach Adams.
It's time to reboot your credit card with Apple Card. Other credit cards often charge annual fees for access to perks you might not even use, or that can come with restrictions. Apple Card gives you valuable benefits without annual fees. In fact, there's not a single fee at all. Apply now in the Wallet app on iPhone and start using it right away. Subject to credit approval, variable APRs for Apple Card range from 15.24% to 26.24% based on credit worthiness. Rates as of January 1, 2023.
This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Most of you listening right now are probably multitasking. Yep, when you're listening, you're probably also driving, cleaning, exercising, or maybe even grocery shopping. But if you're not in some kind of moving vehicle, there's something you can be doing right now. Getting an auto quote from Progressive Insurance. It's easy, and you could save money by doing it right now from your phone. Drivers who save by switching to Progressive save nearly $700 on average, and auto customers qualify for an average of 7 discounts. Discounts for having multiple vehicles on your policy, being a homeowner, and more. So just like your favorite podcast, Progressive will be with you 24/7, 365 days a year, so you're protected no matter what. Multitask right now. Quote your car insurance at Progressive.com to join the over 29 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $698 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2021 and May 2022. Potential savings will vary. Discounts not available in all states and situations.
Hello, listeners. We want to hear from you. Whether it's to ask us for advice on a creative problem, tell us a guest you'd like to hear on the show, or to share your own creative triumphs, drop us a line at working@slate.com or give us a ring at 304-933-WORK. And if you're enjoying this episode, don't forget to subscribe to Working wherever you get your podcasts. Now let's return to Isaac's conversation with Tarn and Zach Adams.
So, as we've said, there's tons of systems. There's systems within systems. There's systems interacting with each other in the background that you'll never know are there. The dwarves' mood might depend on the weather, and then the weather is its own thing. You've been adding, revising, tinkering with them. So other than when fans request them or when you get the sense the audience wants them, how do you know that a new system is needed?
I think it's what wouldn't it be cool if, and then just jam it in there.
Yeah, I mean that's we had a process previously where we the focus of this was sort of to get stories to come out of the game, right? We enjoyed playing games and telling stories to each other, and we actually had a notebook back in high school. We'd pass back and forth, like, you write a chapter, I write a chapter, and how can we make this happen? How can we make this story happen in a game? And really just picking over sentence by sentence, just saying, what kind of mechanics would be needed to get this to happen. And then you see then, even though we've kind of moved away from that process, just it's so much.
That process was a lot of work, though. I mean, I spent so many years writing these stories because we would write the stories and along with crayon drawings, give them to the people that donated to us. And so I spent so much of my time writing these stories that we kind of farmed for ideas.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to write an idea down. And then, right. I mean, especially if you consider something like conversations in a story, I mean, you can sit there and pick apart how maybe you get this conversation to arise, but that's still like an open field in computer science, right?
Yes.
And so you can only do so much with that method. And you still have to think to yourself, what is the most important thing, or what is going to give you the most story juice, I suppose, from the mechanism. And that's kind of the art and craft of the whole thing. That's the core of it, and is figuring out what kinds of mechanics produce the most stories. And we have a feel for that, and we've only more recently tried to theorize about what is actually going on there, so that you could articulate it to other people.
Yeah, and I think the most important thing, though, with a game like this and a simulation is the procedural aspect to it. Right. It's like you got to get so many systems working together that they create something unexpected.
Right. Because, I mean, you can build a lot of systems that do something, whatever it is, but like building them in such a way that a random player sitting down to open the game and start playing it stands a very good chance of having an interesting narrative experience. That's not easy. That's a really complicated thing to attempt.
Yeah, so I mean, look back at Armok with the arm hair curliness, right? I mean, this is when we said this is a horrible approach starting from the bottom up. It's because it didn't lead to stories,
right?
Unless they were stories about arm hair, which people don't tell, right? So you have to start with bigger picture stuff. But the problem with starting bigger picture stuff is you don't have enough little morsels for it to work. Like the game doesn't have pieces to work with. And so you have to do it all. And that's why it's taken 20 years.
But so you've said you've only, some of it's intuitive and you've only recently learned how to kind of talk about it and describe it to other people. Can I pick your brain a bit about what you've learned and how you theorize working these procedural systems so that they generate satisfying narrative? Because, for our listeners who don't know, the game is even just reading about people's experiences of the game are very entertaining. If you go to the Steam website right now and read the reviews of the game, it is just people talking about all the crazy shit that's happened to them in this game. But yeah, so what have you learned about how to create a satisfying narrative experience out of a narrative that you don't control, that a process is controlling?
The starting point was these stories that we were telling, and then you start to get enough pieces. And I mean, the simple examples are things like the body part system and so forth. Not the curliness of the hair, but just the fact that there's no hit points. Right? We were talking about D&D before. Mm-hmm. These simple abstractions, like people aren't going to tell an interesting story about, I got hit and I lost 7 hit points. But if it was I got hit and I lost my right hand and dropped my weapon and was no longer able to defend myself, then suddenly that's a moment, right? And everyone understands that.
That's interesting because, there's a movement within tabletop RPGs towards that as well, with like the Powered by the Apocalypse system and stuff like that, to focus much more on storytelling and much less on hit points and things like that.
Yeah, I think at this point we should say that the stories that we were writing are kind of like Monty Python-esque or so, because they're ridiculous. These are not serious things. We were trying to get the reason that the carp are eating the dwarves is because it's just completely ridiculous, and that's where we're going.
But you don't need. The thing is, like, the ridiculousness comes for free, pretty much. because the computer's going to just do anything with the stuff that you've given it, and most of it's not going to be normal. So it's like you just add those. If you add fish and you add biting, you'll have that kind of stuff happen. And you just know that you're going to get a story because the level of the mechanic it's visible to the player. You have to have exposition there. You have to have the ability to investigate what's going on. Like the player needs to be able to pause, take a breather, and see something strange, even if it's just like a flashing icon over a creature or something, or a new alert. Pause and just be able to check out like what is going on here, and then they might see there's a dwarf is crying or something, and we have ways to investigate that. You can look at their thoughts, and it could be like, oh, they were crying because they were just haunted by the ghost of their dead brother or something, and you're like, okay, now I've got a story. And like this is when it comes back to just having a good interface, which is something that we hadn't had, and that we're hoping will really kind of open things up even more, get so many more people playing the game, but also experienced players notice. Like we had a person playing the game for like 15 years or something, didn't know that there was like a detailed health breakdown by date of what had happened in the hospital, right? So it's like, on the 23rd day of the 8-month or whatever, like sutures were applied to this wound, or rotten tissue was excised, and so forth.
There's just so many systems like that I mean, the problem that we had for the longest time that the Steam release is kind of fixed is that you just don't notice that stuff.
Right.
It's not shown at all. And in the ASCII version, it's hard enough just to play the game, but to find everything in these nested menus that would allow you to see that there were sutures at all, nonetheless, that you're keeping track of them.
Well, I will say, every work of art, there's all sorts of stuff most audience members don't notice, right? It's like, in a book, they don't understand why this word is in that sentence or whatever. In a film, there's details in the background that a set designer has put in that are, of course, extremely important that, most audience members don't see. Because you mentioned the complexity of the menus and stuff, one of the things that Dwarf Fortress is famous for is that it's like not the most user-friendly, amenable to the first-time user series of things, deliberately so. And I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about sort of making the player come to you and learn, or come to the game and learn how the game is played, and how that's part of the process of being part of this world.
Yeah, I mean, it's like you want people to be able to engage and do the things they want to do. And that requires them to become an expert player in a way. Mm-hmm. Whereas like a lot of games now will use an approach with like unlock systems, tech trees, and sort of onboarding slowly through the systems, and menus will kind of unspool over time. And it might not be for, 20 hours until the last option becomes unlocked.
Right.
And it's, just not the direction we wanted to take with the game.
We kind of,
I suppose, but
we kind of accidentally came into this system that really worked for us, though. It's like it wasn't by design, really, at first, that we made the learning. People talk about the steep learning curve that's a cliff. It's like it really helped us become popular, but it wasn't really intentional. It just kept growing and growing and growing, and we kind of lost track of the user interface at some point.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. I mean, to be clear, I'm not criticizing the user interface. It's just one of the things that people notice about it.
Well, feel free, though.
Yeah. It's like we had to work. We worked for 3 years to fix this, and that's all we did. We didn't add anything new, just fix the user interface for 3 years.
So one of the things that anyone who plays this game is going to experience is catastrophe and failure. But one of the things that trains you in is that this is a narrative experience, and narratives end. You don't beat a short story. The short story ends, and sometimes they end badly. You mentioned before that often the systems will take care of failure on their own without you having to do much. Like if you build giant carp and you tell them that they can eat things, eventually they're going to eat the dwarves, right? But could you just talk a little bit about how you think about failure, and how, or whether you even would call it failure or catastrophe or whatever, and how you think of it creatively as part of the creative process of this game?
I think the Legends mode is the answer to this. It's like we always wanted a leaderboard, a high score list, or something like that would tell you that you did something, and maybe that you did better or worse than your last game, but you did something and it needs to be recorded. And that's the starting place, I think.
Yeah. So what can you explain Legends mode in a little more depth and how it relates to the game as is?
So Legends mode is the list of everything that has ever happened in your world, and you would have to type in like the name of the dwarf, and it's kind of like a database more than
like a wiki. It's like going to Wikipedia for your own world. You can look at the pages for characters. You can actually, that's one of the things we added for the Steam version is a tab browser. So it really is like Wikipedia now. You can just open up a tab for like a fortress, even a fortress you've played. Like Legends are not just the past; they're also everything you've done. And there's this other idea though that kind of runs with this, which is a phrase we put in the original manual for the game. Just kind of highlighting it when you read through the introduction to the manual. And then it says, remember, losing is fun. And it's really to get people, and we consciously put that in there so that people would know that you're supposed to play the game multiple times in the same world, that it's supposed to roll on, that you're not supposed to just, I mean, in fact, it was difficult in the original versions to kind of save and reload and save and reload. Like you get used to that from so many other games just to try and because that's just how they're designed, you need to sort of execute well enough that you don't really retain any record of your failure at all. Whereas here, your failures are hopefully interesting enough that you want to retain them, so that if you make a second fortress, say the few survivors from the original fortress will come and have like their whole kind of history available for you, and then you're adding to it.
It's like this kind of thing is almost being lost with the new Steam version, where you can just save and load and save and load. Maybe when adventure mode comes back and there's more chronicles, people will get back into it, and especially with the fortresses, because like we were saying, it's like these kingdoms and stories and all that kind of stuff. Your fortresses story is like the most interesting one,
right? And in adventure mode, for people who don't know, it's then this world that you've been playing in and building fortresses in and stuff, you then get to explore it as an adventurer in a slightly more conventional, I guess, RPG essentially.
Right. It's like it is the size of New Zealand, I guess, what you say. When you take every step down to every step the adventurer can take, it's that big. So as long as it'd take that long for you to walk from one edge of the world to the other. And it's got all these cities and stuff in it. It's like, it's really huge. But again, completely procedurally generated. You have not built every time completely different.
And there's, I mean, it's rough around the edges for sure. And like it's not like a combat game, right? It's not. That's obviously a big part of it. But you can just be a poet if you want, and you can go to different taverns in different cities, and people will listen to you, give you feedback sometimes, and you can write new ones. You could go sit under a tree and write a new poem, go to another town or something. It's really, we're trying to, as we expand different parts of the game, it just expands this kind of single character experience too, and it also lets you see how tied together the world is. Like the fortresses are these fixed in location that kind of spread big out over time, over a fortress might last 20 years or something, whereas these single characters, time doesn't pass very much, but they're spread out over space. And so you really need both modes of the game to tie everything together, spatially and temporally. You can get these really interesting stories to happen. And that happened from the beginning on different community forums and stuff. It was amazing to watch it happen. It'll be great when adventure mode is kind of released on Steam to see a renaissance of that kind of thing.
And when are you planning on that? Hopefully, aspirationally, when is that?
Aspirationally this year.
It's because it's beyond just the art this time. It's like it needs to be ready for prime time. The adventure mode as it is, it's like you can talk to the characters, but they'll always say stuff like, you would talk to them and say, I slew your father or something like that. And the character would just say, that was inevitable.
It's like some things they don't have reactions to and stuff. And we can't fix it all.
Got it.
But we're gonna smooth it off as best we can in the time that we allot ourselves.
So it's now commercially available. You can buy it. And, I will say, if you have a PC, go out and buy it and try it. You'll be surprised by what the experience is like. Even as we've described it at such great length today, it's now got graphics. It's got simple graphics, but it has graphics, not ASCII. It has music. It has, it's a game. I guess there's two interrelated questions I have. One is the decision to actually release it commercially as opposed to it being in a permanent beta or early access or whatever. And the second question is the decision to then do graphics and music and stuff and how you made that happen.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't going to be, I mean, the commercial decision was just practicality. Like if you're working for yourselves, you're not really able to make it in this country after a certain point. There's not enough money for healthcare, and there's no retirement, anything like that, right? It's just it's going to get harder and harder, and we started to experience that.
Right, 2 people working for contributions for the public that are voluntary, and it's like it wasn't enough to pay the bills.
Right,
it just wasn't.
And,
in your 20s, it's like exciting, and then by the time you're in your 40s, it's like, wait a second, what am I doing?
Yeah, it really was, getting to that point in some specific ways. And we were like, okay, gonna have to do something about that. And then after that, it's really well-trodden ground, not to take a text game and turn it into a graphical game, but just, what looks commercially viable here. And we had especially an easy time of it in a sense, because we have kind of created a genre.
Right.
And almost everybody in our genre has better production values than we do.
Right. And also having that baked in, having all those games that were kind of inspired by us, made it so that there's this giant audience that could actually get Dwarf Fortress without their brains being scrambled by how hard it is.
Right. That was actually how I first learned of it, is from the game RimWorld, which is, of course, I think very openly indebted to you guys and what you're doing. And it was like through forums of that or whatever. I was like, oh, there's this other thing. I was like, oh, there's this other thing. It's like on a whole other level.
Yeah, and now we're kind of indebted to RimWorld for having, however millions of Steam players just kind of sitting there, ready to give our game a look if they hadn't already, or if they had and bounced off it, which is more likely.
Well, Tarn, Zach, thank you so much for coming on the show to talk about your creative process and Dwarf Fortress. I feel like I could talk to you for hours. So thank you so much for coming and sharing your work with us.
Yeah, it was great.
It was fun. Yeah, lots of fun. Always fun to talk about dwarves and stuff.
Up next, Isaac and I will expand on some of the great points that Zach and Tarn brought up in their interview.
Hey everybody, it's Tim Heidecker. You know me, Tim and Eric, Bridesmaids, and Fantastic Four. I'd like to personally invite you to listen to Office Hours Live with me and my co-hosts, DJ Doug Pound.
Hello.
And Vic Berger.
Howdy.
Every week we bring you laughs, fun, games, and lots of other surprises. It's live. We take your Zoom calls.
Music.
We love having fun. Excuse me?
Songs. Vic said something.
Songs.
Music.
I like having fun. I like to laugh. I like to meet people who can make me laugh. Please subscribe now.
Hi, I'm Dahlia Lithwick, host of Slate's Amicus podcast, and I'm here to tell you that we have a special offer on Slate memberships. You can now get 3 months of Slate Plus for just $15, and you'll get no ads on any Slate podcasts, member-exclusive episodes and segments on my show Amicus, and shows like Political Gabfest and Slow Burn, and unlimited reading on the Slate site. And best of all, you would be supporting all of Slate's independent journalism as we cover everything that is happening in the news every day. Sign up for Slate Plus at slate.com/podcast plus. Again, that's 3 months for only $15. So sign up now at slate.com/podcast plus.
That was such a fun conversation, and it's so amazing that this game has been around for decades in a way where people could access it for a lot of that time. Working on a project that's this big seems kind of daunting, because when we talk about sharing your work before it's totally done, it's usually with peers rather than just offering it out as a product. Do you think you could ever sustain working on a project for this long in this way?
Heck no. Or maybe yes, actually, now that I think about it, because like having this podcast is sort of like that. I mean, we are always tinkering with it and trying to make it better, and we are in open dialogue with our listeners and stuff. But in terms of like a long-term creative writing project, that sounds absolutely bonkers to me. But books aren't interactive in the way games are, right? So why would you want to do that in a book?
Yeah, but I mean, like, beta is also, I feel like, something that doesn't really exist for
any
a
other
lot
form,
of other mediums. Yeah.
We're beta testing our multi-million-dollar TV show.
Right.
And, I mean, there are test screenings, I guess. That's the equivalent, right?
Anyway, what do you do when you're working on something like this? When you're working on a project that changes, like this one did, from an RPG to more of a fortress sim in such a dramatic way? Of course, the RPG segment is still something that they're working on, as they say, but what we now think of as Dwarf Fortress is mostly the sim part. What do you do when you feel a project is changing? Do you ever try to change it back? Do you leave the old part behind? Is compromise the best option, or is it different from project to project? And how can you tell?
Those are incredibly difficult and important questions because I don't think it's any answer for them is true across the board. I just don't think it works that way. There are times when you just have to embrace the change and go after the new thing. And sometimes that's actually that there's like a shiny thing pointed at your face and you're tired of all the hard work you've put into the old thing, and it's actually a mistake and you need to stick with the old thing. But I think the thing that was key for them listening to this interview again was this moment of, that light bulb moment. Oh, everything I was trying to do in this form or this medium or this genre, whatever, can actually be done and done better in this other one. And that's the really important moment to have. And it's worth saying that it only happened because they were experimenting, which I think is a really vital takeaway no matter what creative field you're in. I think we too often get stuck in our head thinking that we can work a problem out cognitively when actually the only way to work it out is to like do something and then see how you feel about it or how it turns out. You need to do something and then experience something. And off of that, you'll actually figure out what to do next. I mean, our brains are wonderful places to be in, but I don't actually think we should live there all the time.
Yeah, sometimes it is hard to get out of your head.
Totally.
It's also so funny that Dwarf Fortress essentially started out as a side project. And it's amazing to hear that they were working on other games while working on what turned out to be this pretty titanic endeavor. How do you prioritize and balance projects that you're working on? How do you keep your ideas separate? Or do you not have to do that?
Yeah, I've heard a lot of different creators talk about this problem, because often due to, late stage capitalism and whatever, we're all working on multiple projects at once. And how much are they firewalled, or do they all bleed into each other or whatever? I mean, eventually Dwarf Fortress did take over their lives, and now it's their life's work. And one of the things that I found interesting in the interview is that it didn't seem at all weird to them that they had made a choice to work on one video game for the rest of their lives.
Yeah.
And I think that's because they're the kind of people who would make that choice, and I'm just not. I'm too much of a magpie. Like, I find that the thing that often resolves your questions for me, Karen, are like really real world logistical and financial realities. Like, I love to try writing a novel, and occasionally I get ideas for a novel and I write them down in my notes app or whatever, but I need to get going on selling my next nonfiction book and doing this podcast and teaching, because those are the things that actually put food on the table. And so I don't know how I would go about creating the space to do those other things. And I would have to figure that out before I even figure out whether it's a good idea to do so.
Yeah, it's really, I don't know. Like, sometimes when I say this kind of thing, I feel like it's almost a cop-out answer. But I feel like if you take assessment of what you're working on and what your circumstances are, usually these questions will answer themselves for you to a certain extent. Yeah. But it's also a matter of, like, sometimes it's a gamble. Sometimes there's not a clear answer, where it's like, I probably will be okay if I take X step, but there's also a chance that it might go really badly. And in that case, you kind of have to weigh how much you're willing to risk and how much you can shore yourself up to a certain degree to ensure that whatever percentage of chance there is of failure is as small as possible.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, I think what we're circling around is the real question is, like, what is the life I am building?
Yeah.
Right? Because there's so much more to our lives than just the art we make. And I mean, I think that's true in almost any job. It's like the question at the end of the day is like, what is the life I'm trying to build? And is that a life I actually want or not? Certainly when I moved from directing to writing, part of that shift was realizing that the life I was building was one I didn't actually want, because I'd be out of town 6 months a year, and Anne and I wanted to have a kid, and, so on and so forth. So I do think sometimes we're trying to answer that question about our work when it's really about something else.
Yeah, maybe to that end, it's just important to like know what your goals are and how you can work towards them, whether it's very incrementally or taking a big risk and going for it all at once.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's just important to know what you want out of life, which is sometimes also a hard question to answer. That said, talking about lives touching lives, it was really heartening to hear them talk about community, because it's really crucial to build a community, especially for projects that are more on the independent side, in order to ensure that you can support yourself in some way. You generally don't think about it as part of the job, but it really is. Like, you can't, for a lot of us, like, it's not possible to just exist in a vacuum of creativity. Like, you have to engage with your audience and build your audience. How do you delegate time for that? And how do you build that kind of thing? Or is it possible to ignore it?
Yeah, I don't think it's possible to ignore it unless you're like super duper successful and it will just take care of itself, right? And then someone is going to create a fan site for you, and then they're going to be the people, you know, I mean, that sort of thing where it's like, oh, the fandom just exists and it's doing its thing. I mean, Zach and Tarn put a lot of work into their community. It is not just building the website. They have, you know, frequent AMAs.
I was honestly shocked by how much work they said they did about community.
Yeah. And, you know, that community, those community forums on their website, they're the content moderators for them. So, like, you know, they're the ones who have to see all the terrible Nazi images and delete them when trolls come around. And stuff like that. So it's a lot. I have a much lower grade version of this. I get the occasional email from a reader or a listener of Working, and I interact with people on Twitter. And if I visit a school or give a talk or something or do a book reading, you know, I try to be as generous as possible with people there. Yeah. I probably should be more routine about it. Like, these are the, you know, every Thursday when I'm done recording Working, I then answer the email and go on Twitter or whatever. I am just not wired to obey those kinds of routines and schedules. Like, I think June could do that. You know what I mean? But like,
it's also like a lot of emotional labor. Like, there's no way to discount that.
You know, I was talking to an actor who recently started doing conventions. He'd never done them before. And he told me that, you know, it's a really gratifying experience because people are only there because they love you and they love the work you've done and they want to like be in the same room as you. But it's also really draining because you want to give something back to them. You want each person who's, you know, you're signing a picture of yourself or whatever, and you want each one of them to feel like they had a meaningful interaction with you. Yeah. And then at the same time, you're like, also, you have to pay $5 for it or whatever, because conventions charge for that sort of thing. So it's a really weird experience, you know? I think that, though, we should try to give back to the people who are engaging with our work. I mean, our work means something to them, and that's beautiful. That's like so energizing, I think, long term. But I do want to say that there are particularities to that in terms of my being a cisgender, white, Jewish, straight guy. Like, I do not get the kinds of emails that like attractive younger women who are friends of mine get, you know, from people, you know, where there's always like a negging tone to whatever the person is writing to you or whatever. And, you know, I know that, like, from experience from talking to people, that I mostly only get the good stuff. I very rarely get the bad.
Yeah, and it's stuff like you have no personal power over that. Like, there's no way for me to say, only send me nice messages. Like, there's no way for me to control that. I just have to deal with all of it.
Right. No, I agree. But if you are writing to working@slate.com, make sure to say nice things about Karen. That's the and every
say nice things about all of us, please. We love to get gassed up.
It's true. It's true.
Well, that aside, to go back to the conversation that we were talking about, I really appreciated your discussion about jumping into the game too, which brings me to ask, for someone listening to this podcast who might never have played a game before, would you say that this game is easy to get into, or is there a high barrier for entry?
Don't start with this one. Do not. Although, actually, what you could do, which is really fun, this is what I would say. If you want to experience Dwarf Fortress and have like zero experience of video games or very little, watch streams of it on YouTube or read things that people have written about it, because even that will give you a sense of what a bizarre experience this game is. Because the truth is, the difficulty is part of the point of the game. You know, the difficulty is why there's a community. That community formed in part to help people figure out how to play the game and how to survive in a world where, quote unquote, failure is fun, you know?
When was the first time you played Dwarf Fortress? How long have you been playing it?
I haven't been playing it for that long because I only just figured out how to play it on my Mac, which involves like streaming it through a third party thing called Boosteroid.
Oh boy, wait, I guess this is also a good question for this. For anyone who is interested in playing this, what platforms is it available
It's only on PC. It's only on Windows PC.
Okay.
And so I play it through something called Boosteroid, which is their computer is playing the game and I am streaming it via the web and then giving instructions to it. So I haven't been playing it for that long, but I have been watching people play it for quite a while and talking to people who play it. And it really is just like it's just a weird experience.
We really hope that you've enjoyed the show, and if you have, remember to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and then you'll never miss an episode. And just a reminder that by joining Slate Plus, you'll get ad-free podcasts, extra segments on shows like The Waves and Culture Gabfest and our show, and you'll never hit a paywall on the Slate site. To learn more, go to slate.com/workingplus.
Thanks to Zach and Tarn Adams, and special thanks to our producer, Cameron Drews. You know, if a giant carp ate Cameron, I would definitely force reload an old save to get him back. We'll be back next week with June's conversation with Oscar-winning filmmaker Sean Hayter. Until then, get back to work.